Hey everyone, and welcome to our live stream for All Tech is Human. I'm your host, the founder of All Tech is Human, David Ryan Polgar. Thrilled today to be talking about the very important area of misinformation, the information ecosystem, how we can tackle some of this polluted information ecosystem, as we saw with the unfortunate attacks on the US Capitol on January 6th. And also how we balance our rights as individuals to be on these platforms. Really thrilled to have two experts that are heavily involved in improving social media today joining us. We have Dr. Jasmine McNealy, Associate Professor of Telecommunication at the University of Florida. So welcome to our discussion.
Thank you.
We also have Dr. Claire Wardle, co-founder and director of First Draft and an expert on misinformation. One of the reasons why we chose both of you today is thought you could really complement each other's work on misinformation, but also the important areas of law and policy. And before we dig in, also like to thank our partner for this live stream series, which is TheBridge. You can check them out at thebridgework.com. And then for All Tech is Human, check us out at alltechishuman.org. But let's just start right out. Jasmine, I'll start with you. Misinformation, huge topic. Everybody's discussing it right now. Tell us a little bit more about what you're working on, your background, and then specifically how you've changed some of your thinking in light of the January 6th attack.
Well, David, thank you again for having me. As you said, I am an associate professor in telecommunication, which is an antiquated way of saying digital media, but also the associate director of the Marion B. Breckner First Amendment Project here at the University of Florida. I take a kind of untraditional First Amendment stance, or a stance that's not as popular related to the First Amendment, and that is I'm not a First Amendment absolutist, but I think it's really important that we have a conversation about power. And I think with misinformation and disinformation, the key, particularly as we're dealing with social media and platforms, is thinking about power and power dynamics.
Yes.
I know part of the conversation, or a majority of the conversation, is about what to do about when people or individuals encounter disinformation or misinformation and what kind of education we can give to people. But there's a supreme lack of considering how individuals are not equipped to deal with the power that information platforms have, and to deal with the sheer volume of misinformation, disinformation, whatever we want to call it, that they will encounter on these various platforms. But also the idea of amplification. I know one of the arguments is always that, as it deals with politics especially, fake news or false speech has always been around. Absolutely. It has not, however, been able to gain the amount of attention and sheer reach that it has, now with these various social media platforms. So just thinking about power and amplification of the messages that are, false, and the campaigns to spread this kind of information, I think is critically important when we are having this discussion.
It certainly is. And then actually, before we send it over to Claire to learn a bit about what you're working on, Claire, Jasmine, I'd love to have you expand a little bit on the First Amendment, since you mentioned it. That comes up very frequently. So I guess my question is, oftentimes when users are discussing misinformation or content moderation, we tend to approach it, or we tend to think of it, at least in the United States, as, hey, it's Facebook or Twitter or you name it. They're offending my First Amendment right. But however, the First Amendment is written about what government cannot do. And the way it's actually done with a recent Supreme Court decision is that it's actually Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms that have their own First Amendment rights. So could you expand on that? Because it seems to be an area that comes up very frequently and probably an area of a lot of confusion.
Yeah, so particularly we're talking about the First Amendment in the United States. A typical refrain is, if you kick me off a platform, or if you block somebody that I think we should have access to their information, well, you're violating their free expression rights. Well, not exactly. It's not a right under the Constitution for you to be able to use someone else's platform and say whatever you want to say. Maybe ethically, but legally, no. Platforms don't have a responsibility to allow people to just do and say whatever they want to. And in fact, as you've stated, there have been cases where we're talking about analogous to a private person's property, or analogous sometimes to business property, where you're a business invitee and you get to be use the business for certain reasons, but you don't get to use them for all the reasons that you'd want to use them. And that's not your constitutional right in the United States to do that, or to express yourself in any way that you see fit. Okay. Again, also, even if there were a First Amendment right to be using someone else's platform, the First Amendment is not absolute. And when we get into a discussion, I'm sure we're going to talk about it later, into the kinds of misinformation and disinformation and incitement that can happen on platforms, depending on the kinds of expression that are put out there, you don't necessarily have a right to incite particular harms against other people. Okay. And I think that's critical for understanding as well. Another thing is, so we're talking about the First Amendment rights of corporations as well, which adds another wrinkle into this conversation. There's
a lot of wrinkles on this conversation.
Right. There's also Section 230, which is not the First Amendment, but it has expression implications. And so this is obviously a very complex discussion related to law, but I think people confuse constitutional rights related to the government, as you said, versus rights related to corporations, even though, as you said, and this is really important, there's a concentration of power that makes it seem like sometimes these platforms are government in a particular way.
They seem to have. I mean, we had a previous guest talk about, sometimes platforms have this similar power to nation states, and should we treat them in that same capacity? And we also saw kind of, I think it was Denmark. They had their tech ambassador, who's now working with Microsoft. But anyhow, thinking about this relationship. So Claire, I think it's a great time to bring you in, obviously a well-known expert tackling the area of misinformation. Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you and your organization, First Draft, are working on.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to have this conversation. I feel like there are lots of these conversations, and I think, as we've been saying, it's so complex. We need to talk them through. So First Draft is a nonprofit. We were started in 2015. Before misinformation was sexy, we used to help newsrooms verify social media content from breaking news events. And then in 2016, of course, we had Duterte using Facebook in really problematic ways. We had Brexit. We obviously had the US election. And all of a sudden, everybody really cared about how do you decipher what's true online. So at First Draft, we do a lot of research, we do a lot of training, and we do a lot of monitoring to understand this and to understand how the space is shifting constantly. So even something like back in 2015, 2016, we'd say, well, fact checkers, they fact check official claims by politicians, but we are verifying content by unofficial sources. Well, by 2018, it was very clear that one of the biggest proponents of misinformation were politicians themselves, including the leader of the free world. And so kind of understanding all of these elements of who was propagating this, what was the impact, this question of amplification, when if you've got a politician sharing content online, the mainstream media then gives that more oxygen. This whole ecosystem has shifted in front of my eyes almost every single year. The tactics that we were looking at in 2016 have shifted quite considerably, because the more that platforms have made changes and policy moves, bad actors, so-called, have had to shift their tactics. So, for example, we see a lot less outright fake or false content. We see a lot more misleading content, a lot more content that will go right up to the policy line but won't cross it. And that's a deliberate tactic. So, for example, if we're talking about vaccine misinformation, people just saying, I don't know, I'm just asking the question. Does mRNA, does that change my DNA? I don't know. And that's the conversation we were just having. Most misinformation is legal speech. If we're talking about terrorist-related content, child sexual abuse imagery, that is illegal content. And almost irrespective of the jurisdiction, there's a kind of a society-wide acceptance that kind of speech won't be tolerated. Legal speech, which includes pornography, going back to what the platforms do, if they really were protecting First Amendment rights in that way, then they have made a decision they don't want pornography on their platforms. And so that is a corporate decision because they don't think it's good for their bottom line. So they are making these decisions about what they want to moderate or what they don't want to moderate. And so we have to monitor these platforms to understand these shifting tactics and techniques, to then work with journalists, public health professionals, other people to help them understand this ecosystem and how it's changed. So yeah, we're kept busy, let's say that.
It's certainly busy. And you do talk about, like I said, pornography, which obviously ties in with even how Section 230 got passed with bipartisan support in 1996, where it was really focused at that time on pornography and kind of the scare in the late 90s around that topic, giving platforms the right but not responsibility. But you mentioned COVID. So what are you seeing right now around that kind of borderline content? And I'd like to bring up in this section that a lot of our discussion around COVID and the correct precautions is always going to evolve as the science deepens. And one example of that would be early in the pandemic. This is talking about, I guess, March of 2020, you had Gwyneth Paltrow, who at the time it was against conventional wisdom to wear a mask, and she had a mask on and was criticized for that. So I guess my question would be, how do we create an environment where we knock down true misleading information that right now can actually lead to deaths and a lot of danger with COVID-19, but at the same time allow for a certain level of expression to challenge the conventional wisdom, because that's how we normally think of a information ecosystem.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure. I'd love.
I mean, COVID is just this incredible case study, and we need to recognize we've made a lot of mistakes, those of us who are in the kind of quality information space, because in many ways, if we go back to 1996, when we still lived in an ecosystem where there were gatekeepers, that certain storytelling techniques worked then. Now we're in an era where if there's any ambiguity, that gets weaponized. And so the kind of ambiguity that we had at the beginning, which as scientists and researchers, this is how science works. It builds upon replication and additional data. And so early on, when the CDC and WHO could not agree whether masks worked, hadn't decided whether it was airborne transmission. And unfortunately, right at the beginning of the pandemic, the platforms were like, thank God, this isn't political misinformation, it's health misinformation. If we just hang ourselves off the back of the WHO, we'll be safe. And then within about 6 weeks, it was quite clear. They were like, oh God, we can't hang our hat on like this definitive truth, because science is continuously shifting. And so that's unfortunately what we've seen, is that there has been missteps in the public health communication space, even things like preprints, where scientists quite rightly are saying, here's some early data because we think it will help the scientific community. But that's not happening, in a closed environment. It's happening on Twitter, where journalists set up bots so they can see the latest preprints and then amplify it. There's so much about communication that we've learned in the last year. And I think just to say about, there's a spectrum. There's the people suggesting that Bill Gates is going to microchip you. And there's real anti-vax content that of course is problematic. But I would argue those communities are still relatively niche, and those communities are still, there's somewhat of a boundary around that. What I think we forget is there's a lot of people who have very valid questions, by somebody saying, I'm pregnant, should I get vaccinated? I'm confused, Pfizer's got indemnity in the UK, is it safe or not? You see people asking these questions. And I think if, should I be wearing a mask? I don't know. And so if we don't recognize that, is that misinformation? No, that's a vacuum of information, which gets filled by conspiracy and misinformation. So how can those of us who work in the quality information space think about the ways to communicate when there's uncertainty? And so it's not, because also to your point, if quality news providers just said, everybody get vaccinated, they're perfectly safe, and we have a situation in 2 weeks' time when that's not clear, we're going to lose trust forever. So it's really hard. And I'm not saying anything other than that, but doing communication in 2021 is very different from doing communication in 1996. And we've not all necessarily woken up to that.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll get back to the question of power that Jasmine brought up. So Claire, what role do you think platforms should take in pushing users towards quality information, or the latest quality information around COVID-19?
So they have their information centers, which they get excited about, and they tell governments how much they're doing. But I think, and this is to Jasmine's point too, which is how do we educate people about these kind of issues, but in a way that explains that there's difference and that science develops, et cetera, and also not have this kind of, if you talk to platforms, they'll say, listen, we try and put more quality information into people's feeds, but it doesn't mean they click on it. They skip over it. So there's so much here about who should make the decisions about what quality information is, but fundamentally they should be pushing up newsrooms, health professionals. But if they're going to do that, we should also ensure that there is an inconsistency. I mean, there's public health professionals right now on Twitter, quite rightly, having a conversation about, do we need 2 doses? Does it have to be after 12 weeks? I mean, there's a scientific conversation happening on Twitter, but we're also seeing that conversation being weaponized by people taking advantage of that. So it's just really difficult to figure out how the platforms work, because there's so much of what they do that connects and improves our knowledge, but also it can be really detrimental in ways that these unintended consequences that we hadn't even considered.
Certainly. Well, Jasmine, I'll bring you up. We're going to have a bunch of questions, so thank you for that. So anybody watching, please participate. Ask your questions in the comment section. I'll try to weave them into our conversation with our panelists. So we've got a big one right here. What is the line between freedom of speech and misinformation, and who draws it? So I bring that up, Jasmine, because you mentioned the topic of power. So that's something that I imagine some of the platforms are reluctant. I know on my own end, I've always thought that platforms are sometimes in between a rock and a hard place, because there's pressure to act, but then to act is also showcasing a level of unchecked power. So Jasmine, where do you take that question? Because we're seemingly telling platforms to exercise a kind of an arbiter role, but as Zuckerberg pointed out, he certainly, I know his thinking has shifted, but very reluctant to be an arbiter of truth, so to speak, his quote.
Yeah, so if we look at what the government, or I should say the tradition with respect to the government deciding what's truthful, we don't want that. We don't want it with platforms necessarily either, to have a perhaps blanket idea of what is misinformation. Because as Claire was talking about, people are having conversations where they may have beliefs that are wrong, or they don't have enough information to make decisions that they need to make. But shutting off that conversation is just as harmful as having these campaigns, these disinformation campaigns ongoing. So we don't want government necessarily to be involved in that. The idea, usually the traditional idea, first of all, with respect to the First Amendment in the United States, is that false speech, unless it's false advertising, false speech, particularly as it deals with social and political issues, is still protected by free expression principles. It's still protected by the Constitution. We may not like that. Certainly don't like it. But that's what it is, unless there's some harm attached to it, an actual real, true harm, incitement, for example. We're talking about violence, and we're talking about harm that could possibly happen. And that's with government. With the platforms who, as you noted, have this concentration of power, we also want to be careful about who they shut off and how they shut off content. The fact of the matter is that people want to receive information. People want to connect to information and then make choices about what information actually works for them. I'm not going to say is true, but works for them, their sets of beliefs and other things. I think what we have is a problem of trust, and Claire mentioned this as well, like knowing who and what sources to trust for this. And again, we don't want platforms making this choice about who is a trusted source or not. We can always say that the traditional media sources, we can say the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they're trusted or more trusted probably, depending on who you talk to, with respect to the kinds of content they put out. At the same time, what about upstart news organizations? Would Unicorn News be considered a trusted source? They're really young, but they're doing a lot of work. So who gets to decide who gets to be trusted, and whether or not these are the kinds of news organizations that the platforms allow to continue on their site? Again, this is obviously this is a complex conversation, but we don't necessarily want platforms to be like, no, this news organization doesn't meet our standards of what's a trusted source or a good source necessarily.
Well, that's the question then I'll ask over to Claire. I mean, because at the same time, you do have a lot of services that are trying to kind of rank the news. I mean, you have NewsGuard and other organizations like that create like a green light, red light to a lot of news. And you are going to rank, the Gateway Pundit below the New York Times. So Claire, where do where do you think about that question? Is what is the role of platforms to create a little bit of a gatekeeping type of role with what's even quality information? Do you think they have a role to play there, or do you think that is too much power for them to exercise?
It's too much power. And I also think that going back to the information ecosystem in 2021, I do think there's a kind of naivete about, well, somebody just gives it a traffic light system, or we just need more nutritional labels. People are going to seek out information that reaffirms their worldview, and that is true across the political spectrum. And so ultimately about the internet means that you can go searching and you can find people that believe the same things as you, whether the earth is flat or whether or not, the president is really the president, whatever it is, people are seeking that. And I think this idea of, well, we put a traffic light system on it and then the platforms will only prioritize those outlets that have a green, because as Jasmine said, the idea, like there'll be many people who might be watching, probably not watching this, but the idea that the New York Times is trusted, they would, throw everything out of the water. And so, that we do have very different information ecosystems. And the reason that there is an information ecosystem that's really flourishing, and it tends to be on the right and more libertarian spaces, is because of this belief that their ideas have not been reflected in the mainstream media. And so, my worry is, and we saw this with Parler developed because there was a frustration that people couldn't say the things that they wanted to say. And as we know, had almost non-existent content moderation policies, et cetera, et cetera. So when we only focus on Facebook and Google and Twitter, yes, they've been around a long time, but we're seeing now with Clubhouse and, all of these closed messaging apps, that we can't be naive about all of these things. But just to pick up on this point of who makes decisions, I am deeply frustrated that we, when I say, more generally, didn't have a framework by which we could say, probably in the future, something bad will happen and very big decisions will have to be taken about content. And can we have a group of academics, ethicists, journalists, civil society, human rights professionals to help with that? No, we didn't. And instead, on the 8th of January, a bunch of mostly white dudes in Silicon Valley started just be like, let's take these people off. There was a domino effect. There was no archiving, no transparency, no understanding of how they've made those decisions. And so the great deplatforming happened very much in a US context. We do a lot of work globally. Who is the Alex Jones of Nigeria? Who is the QAnon of, Myanmar? And so the complete absence, and I don't want to get into the Facebook oversight board, but I'm just deeply saddened that there hasn't been an oversight body that, with all these governments talking about regulations, something that could be a third party auditing mechanism, because the idea that those decisions were taken very quickly, with probably all of them just DMing each other, being like, we're taking them down. It's extraordinary to me in 2021, that's what happened. So I think all of these questions about who's making decisions on the platform side, about who's a good authoritative source or who should we take off, it is mind blowing to me that there's a bunch of American based companies making those decisions every day and there's no transparency.
That's a good point. And that's actually one of the projects we worked on with All Tech is Human. Just recently put out a report on improving social media, kind of arguing for a collective, holistic approach, as opposed to, hey, let's just put Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg, in front of Congress. But we have a couple great questions I really want to get to. We have Ann Collier, who's done some amazing work in the space over the last 20 years. She has a question that really hints to, Claire, what you brought up, but I'll ask it to Jasmine at first, that, hey, life has really changed since 1996. So Anne asks, are platforms social institutions now, media companies, publishers, right? Because that always comes up. And we saw an earlier question on Section 230. Even though we have media in the name, it's not something that falls under the FCC. So it is going to be different, normally thought of as kind of a conduit for user-generated content. But then at the same time, we've seen, whether it be TikTok or Facebook, they're producing content, right? So Facebook has Facebook Watch. So they seem to be kind of a hybrid. So Jasmine, I'm curious about your perspective, because obviously it has major legal implications, but also the legal world can alter the implications to those tech companies. So I'm curious what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so I think platforms are all of the above. They have their role in the various different parts of that were named, the social institutions that they're creating and continue to sustain. They are producers of content themselves, not just using the UGC or the user-generated content, but they are, like you said, Facebook Live. They have their own shows. They have their own, content creation branches or teams in their the organizations. They're all of those things. They're also ISPs, right? Like, so we saw Facebook is the internet service provider in certain parts of the world. And people, are rightfully concerned about those kinds of things. So with respect to legislation or regulation, it really will depend on what part of the organization you're attempting to regulate. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about Section 230, are you talking about the content that they allow to be published on their site? That's where they'll get protection. But if you're talking about the content that they created themselves, that may be a different thing, because then they're actually involved in the development of content, which basically kind of removes that Section 230. So 230 is about basically a kind of passive, okay, you allowed this content to be published. You may have been involved in a little bit of editing down, but you weren't really involved in developing that content. But if you are actually, creating shows, then that changes who you are and how you can be regulated. So Section 230 is not a blanket absolution from whatever comes up on a platform. Mm-hmm. As far as the social institution power, this is the power conversation we keep having. Like, who's allowed to inhabit the domains that you've allowed people to create? What kind of speech is available, or what kind of content's available? What kind of rules are you creating? And how you enforce those rules, which is probably less of a legal question, but more of an ethical question, a governance question that we need for platforms. We do need the oversight, like Claire noted earlier, but this is not necessarily a First Amendment question with respect to what platforms are doing with that social aspect. I mean, we're seeing, obviously, as new platforms come about, whether they're long-staying platforms or just, upstarts that, do a little fizzle for a year, that content moderation is a huge question and a huge problem, but also the targeting of people on platforms, and how there's a vague or ambiguous way that platforms are treating different groups of different kinds of people when there's complaints about what's happening. So all of this is a question that obviously is complex. We've said that more than once already, but also that needs to be a focus of oversight and regulators, but to a lesser extent for the regulators, because it's going to be really hard in the United States anyway for there to be regulation related to, content.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move outside of the United States for a little bit, because I know I've received a lot of questions when people signed up for this, and I'll bring up a question now as well, really focused on the fact that oftentimes we talk about the US and Europe. So misinformation is a threat everywhere, but the major spotlight is particularly in the US and Europe. How can your work protect other countries who don't have as much light shed on, but are affected? So Claire, I'd love for you to take that question. How can we focus on other countries, especially if we talk about the great digital divide? I know with Myanmar and with WhatsApp a couple of years ago, you had issues around, hey, here are countries that basically didn't have the same evolution of technology in terms of its access and use, and just now all of a sudden have a smartphone and have Facebook, and don't necessarily have the same potentially media literacy, digital literacy training that could have happened in our education system in the United States. So I'm curious where you take that question. Where do you see other countries and their role in this?
I could talk about this for days. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Brooklyn. I do live in the US. And I mean, we do work globally. And one of my deep frustrations is most of the money to fund this kind of work is from US funders who want to fund US work. Like back in 2017, we were doing a lot of work in APAC, and we were talking about the importance of closed messaging apps. And people were like, oh, nobody uses WhatsApp in the US. And I'd be like, diaspora communities do. Communities of color do, who don't want to be surveyed. But okay, if you want to pretend that it's not coming. And I think, obviously, with America, there's often a sense that America leads and the rest of the world follows. And actually, I think with disinformation, the reverse was true, and there wasn't awareness of that. But for example, we've done a lot of work on elections, because they were the sorts of things that people would fund. And so back in Brazil in 2018 was when I really understood the power of WhatsApp. And I would see a place that had paywalls against almost all quality news outlets. And so it was very difficult for people to access quality information. Yet WhatsApp and Facebook was free because Facebook had, zero basics, which basically meant that no data costs if you're on WhatsApp or Facebook. So surprise, surprise, people spent all day on those spaces sharing screenshots of news articles, but also lots and lots of false information. And I had this sudden moment of there's so much to learn from other countries, but there just isn't an awareness that, the rumors that we see in the US, we're already seeing them in, the Philippines or Nigeria. There aren't boundaries to the internet, which is why all of the legal and regulatory conversations are so fascinating, because every country is coming up with its own response, not understanding that, the information, the rumors cross borders. So I find it deeply frustrating that we don't have a global response to this. I sometimes joke that we need a UN agency for disinformation, except we don't, because that would be a disaster. But we need something that is globally able to compete with the scale, resources, and agility of Silicon Valley. So we don't need a huge bureaucratic response, but we need something that is properly global, because at the moment we are on the back foot when we keep thinking about this from a country-based level. But I do think there's a lot to learn from the rest of the world that in many ways America isn't seeing, but it's the worst of the worst. And I think some of the frustrating conversations about the 6th was as if it was the first time this had happened. And of course, human rights activists were like, hello, can I just remind you of all the conversations we've had in, Ethiopia right now, continuing Myanmar and other places that just people haven't taken seriously. Yet we should have learned the failures there meant that, of course, they were going to fail here.
Well, do you see any movement towards adopting some of the, work that's coming out of countries outside of the United States and Europe that could be kind of incorporated? I'll give you an example. Is Australia. They're doing a lot of work around safety by design. And obviously, they've had a lot more aggressive rules around this. And then especially New Zealand after the Christchurch massacre, they really kind of pushed and got a lot of people involved when they had a gathering in Paris right after. So do you see any type of movement in that space where we're trying to learn from how all different parts of the world are approaching this issue?
Yes, I mean, there's amazing work happening globally, and I wish there was more of a spotlight. And sometimes people would say to me, why does nobody know about my work? And I have to say, unless you get a Washington Post op-ed or New York Times, it's deeply frustrating that there are only certain avenues where you'll get that. But I mean, obviously I'm European, GDPR is not perfect by any stretch, but a real attempt to think about user privacy. And I think to this point about Jasmine, you were saying, I don't think regulation is going to happen in the US. I completely agree with you. But I do think what's interesting is if a country, and maybe that's New Zealand, the UK is doing interesting things around Ofcom. I was doing something with the Irish government earlier today. It would be interesting if a government can come up with a framework that then might be usable, or to some degree, the platforms might say, listen, we can't do pop-up regulation for every single nation, but this is a framework that we could work with. So I'm kind of interested at watching country level responses, because I think that there might be a way to scale it. But culturally, there's so many differences. In Europe, we have a different idea around hate speech, and I think I love the idea that you talked about First Amendment absolutism. I struggle sometimes to have conversations in this country because it's like, First Amendment, Claire, have you read it? And the conversation gets shut down. I'm like, I know, but ... So I do think that there might be spaces in other countries to have these conversations. Whether or not they would be applied in the US is a different matter.
Although I will point out, under the First Amendment, you can have Holocaust deniers, which obviously you can't have in a country like Germany. But you did see Zuckerberg recently evolve his stance on that, whereas originally they said they would allow Holocaust deniers, and now they said they will not. So it seems to be moving away from that strict kind of American First Amendment type of thinking. So I'm very curious about that. But Jasmine, I want to kind of pull it over to you. We also got this comment similar to what Claire was mentioning about maybe having an international organization that can tackle this, that's less bureaucratic potentially than the United Nations, but is in a polarized country, is what Hira is talking about. In a polarized country, or where government's trust is low, who is best positioned to deliver this service? So Claire, you mentioned your accent. My accent is American, so I'm going to be trying to be more optimistic. So I'm curious then, Jasmine, are you optimistic about any type of group or any type of movement being able to get their hands around this topic and make some positive movements to have more of a kind of holistic collective approach with this?
So I think when we look at collectives that are organizing related to this kind of things, of academics, scholars, journalists, other like civil society actors. I think that that's a way to move or try to angle this, because those groups have, one, the opportunity to involve people from around the globe, which is obviously a necessity with respect to tackling these issues of disinformation, and looking at what other countries have done, or what has happened in other countries, right? So as Claire mentioned. So I think those kinds of collectives coming up with frameworks, advising perhaps governments, advising people and other organizations, and maybe persuading platforms as far as what they could do to attempt to stem the tide of disinformation, misinformation without, I don't know if going overboard would be even, scratching the surface of what could possibly happen, but also to getting governments and platforms to really have a threat kind of risk assessment, like what are the possibilities that could happen? So we've seen disinformation, misinformation, we've seen that happening. It's obviously continuing, but what are the other threats related to content that are connected to this, that are coming down the pike, that haven't exploded yet, but are coming? And where have we seen those? Where have we seen indicators? Having this kind of like risk assessment and threat assessment is really important. So those collectives doing that work, and the ability to get that information out to policymakers, but also to platforms and persuade platforms, I think is really important.
Well, that's the question I want to quickly ask both of you. And Jasmine, I'll start with you. Are there any organizations or people that you think are doing very valuable work that you think is on the right path? Because here we're talking about things that aren't working. Love to hear some kind of individuals or organizations that you think are on the right path and doing some great work. So Jasmine, are there anybody who comes to mind, or any organizations?
So yeah, there are quite a few, obviously Claire, but I also don't want to like forget people and have people be.
No, sure. This isn't an Oscar speech. Don't worry.
Like, folks like Joan Donovan.
Yes.
At the Kennedy School. I think there are quite a few groups at Data and Society in the United States doing work. On the West Coast, there's folks at UCLA and Stanford. There's a lot of different people doing work. If I'm sorry if that didn't name you,
sure.
But there are quite a lot of people who are doing work, who are attempting to connect with platforms too, and consult with employees at platforms to try to get the employees involved, right? To make changes as to what's happening at platforms, and to get scholars to really focus on not just the fact that the misinformation or disinformation exists, but looking at how we can change things with respect to misinformation and disinformation. And I think that's really important.
Okay. And then Claire, what about yourself? Are there any organizations or individuals that you think are on the right path with where we need to go on this issue?
Yeah, so something that I've been really talking a lot about recently is this idea that we kind of have two information ecosystems. So the one that we inhabit is unfortunately still pretty top-down, hierarchical and linear. And it's all about if we get the right messages from the right messengers in the right formats. It's a very hypodermic needle approach. If we actually look at what was happening around the 6th, it was a very participatory movement. Like Stop the Steal had 2 months of people being told that they were part of a movement. They could find evidence. If they could find another piece of the puzzle, it would go, it would become evident. It was participatory. It's non-hierarchical. It zips between, your golfing buddies in a Facebook page, to Gateway Pundit, to Ted Cruz, to, local talk radio, Fox News, the president, and messages ricochet around. And I keep thinking about that and thinking, how can we recognize the importance of that? And I would say that in our space, there hasn't been a recognition of how do we properly work with communities. There's been, we should resource media literacy, but it's still very top down, very passive. And actually, how do we embed? And I have to say, the last year and a half working a lot with public health professionals, they of course know exactly that you embed with communities. It's resource heavy, but it's one-to-one conversations. It's working directly with those who understand the concerns of the community, understand what would work, understand who's trusted. And I think that we have this sense of like who's trusted, but it's again very 1996, and we've completely failed to understand how digital works with offline conversations. So, for example, community media. Very early, I used to be an academic left in 2009. And then the London riots happened in 2011. I mean, it seems like forever ago. And remember at the time, the BBC paid all this money for a helicopter to watch the fires around London. And then afterwards, I heard all these community radio, then the BBC was like, we don't know how this happened. And then all these community radio stations were like, we could have told you for the last 2 years this was going to happen. You just never talked to us, BBC, because you're the fucking BBC and you got all this money. But we were with our communities who were getting increasingly angry. And that is just a story that I just think about all the time, is how are we reaching community media? How are we really engaging with people on the ground? And it's, again, not cheap, not quick. But we're only going to get out of this if we stop thinking about this, about messengers coming down, and really think about how do we, just let's say it. We got to learn from the other information ecosystem and give people agency. And at the moment we're not, and that's kind of why we're failing.
So do you think that the actual platforms need to be directly tied within these communities, or do you think that they have these partnerships and relationships with larger organizations that are doing a lot of the boots on the ground work with communities, and then they are tied in with the platforms?
Yeah, because it goes back to power. So who do they give ad credits to? Who do they promote in their algorithms? And this, I mean, we haven't really had this conversation with the First Amendment, but it's like, oh, marketplace of ideas. Well, it's not, because algorithms are determining which market stalls you see and which you don't. And so when we're thinking about embedding with communities, if you're a really small civil society org, are you going to get anywhere unless you have to pay a lot of money to advertise on Facebook? No. So like all of those kind of dynamics are critical if we're going to take this seriously, because, there's, who do you trust? You trust the WHO, your local national health provider, or your local doctor, or your local community health group, or your church. Like, who is it that you're trusting? And it differs by different people. And so, those kind of things we have to understand and just think very, very differently about the way that our current information ecosystem is working. And the platforms need to be part of it, but fundamentally, this is needs to be people powered.
I agree. Yeah. And that's obviously a lot of what we're trying to do at All Tech is Human. As we're kind of nearing an end, I do, again, want to thank our partners at TheBridge. Check them out at thebridgework.com. And then also our organization, All Tech is Human, as alltechishuman.org. We recently released our report on improving social media that you can find at improvingsocialmedia.com. I also want to thank Radical AI Podcast. This is going to be running on the Radical AI Podcast. We'll also have curated resources, so you don't have to take down copious notes. We're going to curate it all for you. So Jasmine and Claire, I want to come back to you one last time for any final thoughts you have, but also where people can continue this conversation, because as we talked about, we could continue this for the next couple of weeks, right? But we don't have time, and we're not going to live stream that much, and I'm not going to hook up a catheter, right? We're just not going to do that. But what we are going to do is we want people to stay in touch with you and to stay in touch with your valuable work. So Jasmine, I'll start with you. Any final thoughts, and where can people stay in touch with you?
So final thoughts is, obviously this is a very complex issue that continues to need to be studied. I also want to say, though, that it's really important that we look at the different kinds of media that people can interact with beyond social media that is still fruitful. So radio, particularly, I live in Florida, radio is still fruitful. You want to know why? Because radio stations still stay up when there's a hurricane. So what are the other sources of media, sources of information, and where is there a void of media or information that can take the place of these spaces like social media where people are encountering disinformation? Obviously, I'm at the University of Florida. I'm on Twitter, and folks can find me there.
Terrific. Yeah. And as you mentioned, it's kind of funny that here we thought originally with the web that there'd be information superhighway. Now we're talking about infodemics, or kind of like information desert, if you will. So Claire, what about yourself? Any final thoughts, and where can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, so I think one thing we have to recognize is not only is it complex, it's shifting continuously. And I think my concern about any kind of regulatory conversations is that we're regulating for 2017. And so I think one thing I'd say is that we just need to keep being aware of how things are shifting. And yeah, we are at firstdraftnews.org, and we have a latest section where we're always writing articles, but we have a training section, lots of free downloadable tools. We have a 14-day SMS course. So if anybody does work with their communities, that we have lots of resources designed to help people do that. So yeah, and we're on Twitter.
That's wonderful. So again, Dr. Jasmine McNealy and Dr. Claire Wardle, thank you for coming on for our discussion with All Tech is Human. My name is David Ryan Polgar, the founder of All Tech is Human. And I would also advocate for anybody who wants to be part of this solution, stay in touch with us at alltechishuman.org. And we recently started a Slack channel to start kind of joining forces on this important issue. So Jasmine, Claire, thank you all for coming on, and thank you everyone for your participation. Have a good day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.